Welcome to the Dark Nook Monster Shop. I decided to make a TinMan, but I wanted my TinMan to be a zombie. If you've been watching my videos, you know that you're awesome, and that I've been testing out foam clay recently. I picked up a bunch of these silicone molds from Amazon, because the big advantage of this material is that it starts out soft like clay, and then dries into a firm foam that's surprisingly strong even when it's thin. So I can squish it into molds when it's soft, and it'll dry into a hard foam piece. The big disadvantage of this material is that it takes about 24 hours for this stuff to fully dry, so every step of this process takes a day. That's why this video took so long to make. I've been working on this one for a minute. Now, here's a bunch of bottles. Sports drinks, sauce bottles, mouthwash bottles. I do a thing called shape shopping. I go shopping for the shape of a package, not for the product itself. I go looking for textures and symmetrical shapes and patterns in the plastic packaging. Now these bottles become molds. Start looking at the shapes. At this point, I have no idea what these parts are going to be or how they're going to fit together. All I know is I'm going to build a zombie TinMan around these cool looking gears. So I'm just using these bottles to make shapes, panels, things I can layer over the gears and then cut away. At this point, this takes no special talent beyond buying some silicone molds off Amazon and some products in plastic bottles at your local dollar store and then squishing foam clay into them. I know I want to replicate the idea of a zombie with bones showing through rotten skin, but I want gears showing through rusted metal. I want broken bits hanging off like guts hanging out. And I want to make him look crusty, corroded, rusty, and old, like he's been standing around in that forest for a long time. I also roll the clay against the lids to get the corrugated texture and then peel it away and set it aside to dry, again, for another 24 hours. Now as these come out of the mold, and they usually just pop right out, you can start to see how the foam clay will hold the shapes and textures of the inside of the bottles. But at scale, these chunky square symmetry, it starts to make them look like metal panels or armor plates. And here's really the first sculpting that I do on this project, and just a simple generic mechanical shape. Which I then set aside to dry. I now have a general idea of what pieces I need to replicate and what stuff I need to create. I need tapered side panels and some flat panels with bigger and more pronounced texture. So let's go check the kitchen. First, I pull these out of the molds and everything looks good. I'll peel these off the plastic, and I'm honestly not even really sure how I'm going to use these. I'm just making all the parts that I could possibly need. I think this will make a good neck piece. And here I found a solution. A different sports drink bottle for the tapered sides, and an instant ramen soup bowl for the more pronounced ridge texture panels. I also used the caps to make rounded mechanical looking pieces. When I smush the clay into the bowl, I don't want to push too hard or it'll get too thin and then it'll rip when I try to peel it off. I want to create a degree of robotic symmetry, but also organic looking decay. I use these lids as texture rollers to roll different patterns and textures into the clay, and then I let it dry. Again. Take a look at how strong this stuff is. It's very thin, almost too thin in a few spots, and it still holds the texture and the curve of the bowl really well. I also use a sports drink cap and a couple other caps to roll textures into the clay, and the clay held the rolled texture perfectly. And check out those sides. Okay, then I got a little crazy sticking foam clay to stuff to get the patterns. I used cups, I used some other stuff, Another noodle bowl. So on to the armature. I want this guy to be freestanding, and at this point, I decide to build it from the inside out on a light wooden dowel armature. I'm just going to cut the dowels apart and hot glue them back together in position with some Q-tips and toothpicks for added support. Another big advantage of foam clay is that it's light, really light, so the armature doesn't need to be much. It doesn't have to support much weight. But I think I will incorporate the armature into the build itself so you can see it, since that'll just make it look more robotic. Now, I know at first glance this looks like weak, rickety junk, because it is, but if I've learned anything from Planet of the Apes, it's that a bunch of sticks together are strong, especially if you use hot glue. I think that was the point. Anyway, as I add more support, cotton swabs, and toothpicks, the skeleton/armature starts to get very stable. Now, I start to get an idea of how I'm going to position the gears. I want a kind of fantasy mechanical, where it looks machined and symmetrical and generally mechanically plausible. So now I start adding in the textured pieces. The point of this bottommost layer is so if I cut away the top layer above it, there's not just empty space below it. There's something that looks like it's supposed to be there. I trim pieces to fit and start gluing them on in layers. I call this windows and curtains. If you're looking at a window from the outside, you should see the curtains on the inside. So if I show you a window, like removing the skin off a zombie, then I need to show you the curtains inside, which would be like the bones and the guts. Because if it's just empty space, your brain immediately rejects it and the effect is ruined. I'm just adding layers and panels and gluing them in place. I trim here and there to make it fit. I'm building up the structure of the body, basically, the shape of the body. I'm just gluing pieces to other pieces and building up the shape of the body. God damn it, kitten. Do you want to meow every time I talk? Think maybe you could not? I'm just gluing pieces to other pieces. She's such a shithead. All that's holding the arms on is some glue, sandwiched between two bits of foam. I decided I was going to have him dragging his axe, so he'll have 3-point stability. So as I glue the dowels in place for his arms, I'm positioning one dragging behind him and one reaching in front of him. I also position the legs so that he's stepping forward. As the body takes shape, I start adding more and more random bits and greeblies just to add scale and some mechanical surface texture. Now I start making the axe. I start by shaping a little foam clay around a kebab skewer to make the head of the axe. Then I set it aside to dry. I start on the feet. I have these weird little clips that were part of the packaging from something, the kind of thing you keep in a dusty box under your workbench for 2 or 3 years and then suddenly find a use for. Well, feet are the use. Big, flat robot feet. I add some more gears and I start making some new pieces with a different ramen soup container. I keep adding to the body and building up the body panels and then adding more detail. I cut 4 toothpicks in half and use them as the backs of the hands, and add some little bits on the hands to build them up. I decide to reinforce the feet with some plastic sprue bits from a model kit. Once glued, I shape the foam clay around it and I use my awl to add some basic shapes. Then I'll trim back the clay and make it look like parts are broken and showing through, and then I'll do the same to the other foot. Now that step 1 of the axe is dry, I can make the handle. I use the handle of my awl to roll the clay into the shape I want, and then I add some wood texture lines with the kebab skewer. Then I trim off the top bit and leave it to dry. On to the head. I use a latex mold I made in a previous video, but this is only a front half mold, so I'm going to have to cheat a little bit and build up the back. I use a paintbrush to push it into the mold, and I want half of this face to be broken away, and so I'm making half of it very thin so it'll rip out easily. Now back to the axe. I add more clay to make the axe head bigger, and I add a few other details like where the handle pokes through the top of the axe. I trim the feet and make some final pieces on the back of the soup container. I make some little finished looking bits and greeblies to hide some seam lines and to add in a final detail layer later. I let those dry again. Once dry, I peel up the new pieces and demold the head. But as I planned, the thin part of the face breaks away. This is good because it means the edges will be ragged instead of clean, like I cut it. Then I bumped my camera and didn't know the top of my frame was lower. So all the cool head making stuff is just out of frame. I tried to salvage some of it, but yeah, I made a cool little jaw piece, all just out of frame. So, I go on to add more bits and pieces just to add more detail and surface texture. Some panels I want to look like they're missing, and others I want to look like they're in the process of falling off. I make his funnel hat by wrapping some clay around a bit from the bottom of one of the bottles and shaping it into a funnel, adding a tube to the top and a little random spoke pattern. I add more panels and more bits of wood and then some fingers. Now it's time to start cutting holes and doing damage. I clip and twist so it rips a bit, leaving the edge looking more ragged. And like I said, that looks better than if it was just clean cut, because it's supposed to be rusting. I change my hand position often when I'm cutting so I don't get a bunch of similar angled cuts in the same area, because your eye will be drawn to that. I glue the axe on so it will provide that third point of support. Then I add the fingers around the axe handle. I also add some little cable or wire looking bits to kind of imply tendons. Oh, then I finally notice my camera is down and fix it. Now I use my new mini heat gun, dope, to melt all the little stringy bits of hot glue. Now it's time to start painting. I airbrush on a black base coat, several coats in fact, on the inside and the outside. Once that's dry, I do more cutting damage and really expose the bits underneath. Any part that looks too nice and smooth once the base coat's on gets some work. And then it's more black paint. And when that's all dry, it's on to the silver metallic dry brushing. I start stippling on shades of brown and orange for the rust and corrosion. Then I use a pump spray bottle with a thin brown wash in it. I mix oranges and brown and some bronze colors together in random combinations to get different kinds of shades of corrosion, so everything looks a little bit different and a little bit organic every time I add a little more paint. I add a final wash and some lighter colors to highlight the edges. I paint the axe handle, and then once that's done, I add one last wash to look kind of like old grease stains. And if you're still watching, thanks for checking out my video and listening to me jabber for 20 minutes. Please leave a comment, hit the like button, or the dislike button, or the "it was just okay" button. That one says subscribe. And that's the Tin Man done. So on to the final shots.